social segmentation. But if this goes well, and if people like it, then I can always do longer readings, different parts of the book. So let me know in the comments what you'd like me to do next. But please be nice, because I'm still learning how to do this. Bit by bit, the equipment's getting better, so we'll see where we go. But all productive and friendly comments are welcomed. So when you do that as well, or if you don't, please make sure you also like, share, subscribe, and when you subscribe, make sure you click the little bell by subscribe, because then you'll get notified whenever I have a new video out. So without any further ado, let's get started. Micropolitics and Segmentarity. We are segmented from all around and in every direction. The human being is a segmentary animal. Segmentarity is inherent in all the strata composing us. Dwelling, getting around, working, playing. Life is spatially and socially segmented. The house is segmented according to its rooms' assigned purposes, streets according to the order of the city, the factory according to the nature of the work and operations performed in it. We are segmented in a binary fashion, following the great major dualist oppositions, social classes, but also men, women, adults, children, and so on. We are segmented in a circular fashion, in ever larger circles, ever wider discs or coronas, like Joyce's letter. My affairs, my neighbourhood's affairs, my cities, my countries, the world's. We are segmented in a linear fashion, along a straight line or a number of straight lines, of which each segment represents an episode or proceeding. As soon as we finish one proceeding, we begin another, forever proceduring or procedured, in the family, in school, in the army, on the job. School tells us, you're not at home anymore. The army tells us, you're not in school anymore. Sometimes the various segments belong to different individuals or groups, and sometimes the same individual or group passes from one segment to another. But these figures of segmentarity, the binary, circular, and linear, are bound up with one another, even cross over into each other, changing according to the point of view. This is already evident among, quote, savage peoples. Lizo shows how the communal house is organised in circular fashion, going from interior to exterior in a series of coronas within which certain types of localizable activities take place. Worship and ceremonies, followed by exchange of goods, followed by family life, followed by trash and excrement. At the same time, each of these coronas is itself transversely divided. Each segment devolves upon a particular lineage and is subdivided among different kinship groups. In a more general context, Levi Strauss shows that the dualist organization of primitive peoples has a circular form and also takes a linear form, encompassing any number of groups, at least 3. Why return to the primitives when it's a question of our own life? The fact is that the notion of segmentarity was constructed by ethnologists to account for so-called primitive societies, which have no fixed central state apparatus and no global power mechanisms or specialized political institutions. In these societies, the social segments have a certain leeway between the two extreme poles of fusion and scission, depending on the task and the situation. There is also considerable communicability between heterogeneous elements, so that one segment can fit with another in a number of different ways. And they have a local constitution excluding the prior determination of a base domain, economic, political, juridical, artistic. They have extrinsic seems to us difficult to maintain that state societies, even our modern states, are any less segmentary. The classical opposition between segmentarity and centralization hardly seems relevant. Not only does the state exercise power over the segments it sustains or permits to survive, but it possesses and imposes its own segmentarity. Perhaps the opposition sociologists establish between the segmentary and the central is biological deep down, the ringed worm and the central nervous system. But the central brain itself is a worm, even more segmented than the others, in spite of and including all its vicarious actions. There is no opposition between the central and the segmentary. The modern political system is a global whole, unified and unifying, but is so because it implies a constellation of juxtaposed, imbricated, ordered subsystems. The analysis of decision-making brings to light all kinds of compartmentalizations and partial processes that interconnect, but not without gaps and displacements. Technocracy operates by the segmentary division of labour. This applies to the international division of labour as well. Bureaucracy exists only in compartmentalised offices and functions only by goal displacements and the corresponding dysfunctions. Hierarchy is not simply pyramidal. The boss's office is as much at the end of the hall as on top of the tower. In short, we would say that modern life has not done away with segmentarity, but has on the contrary made it exceptionally rigid. Instead of setting up an opposition between the segmentary and the centralized, we should make a distinction between two types of segmentarity, one primitive and supple, the other modern and rigid. This distinction reframes each of the figures previously discussed. 1. Binary oppositions, men, women, those on top, those on bottom, etc., are very strong in primitive societies, but seem to be the result of machines and assemblages that are not in themselves binary. The social binarity between men and women in a group applies rules according to which both sexes must take their respective spouses from different groups, which is why there are at least 3 groups. Thus Levi Strauss can demonstrate that dualist organisation never stands on its own in this kind of society. On the contrary, it's a particularity of modern societies, or rather state societies, to bring into their own duality machines that function as such and proceed simultaneously by bi-univocal relationships and successively by binarized choices. Classes and sexes come in twos, and phenomena of tripartition result from a transposition of the dual, not the reverse. We have already encountered this, notably in the case of the face machine, which differs in this respect from primitive head machines. It seems that modern societies elevated dual segmentarity to the level of a self-sufficient organisation. The question, therefore, is not whether the status of women or those on the bottom is better or worse, but the type of organisation from which that status results. 2. Similarly, we may note that in primitive societies, circular segmentarity does not necessarily imply that the circles are concentric or have the same centre. In a supple regime, centres already act as so many knots, eyes, or black holes, but they do not all resonate together. They do not fall on the same point. They do not converge in the same black hole. There is a multiplicity of animist eyes, each of which is assigned, for example, a particular animal spirit, snake spirit, woodpecker spirit, caiman spirit. Each black hole is occupied by a different animal eye. Doubtless, we see operations of rigidification and centralization take shape here and there. All of the centers must collect on a single circle, which itself has a single center. The shaman draws lines between the shaman is still entirely localized, strictly dependent upon a particular segment, contingent upon drugs, and each point continues to admit independent sequences. The same cannot be said of modern societies, or even of states. Of course, the centralized is not opposed to the segmentary, and the circles remain distinct, but they become concentric, definitively arborified. The segmentarity becomes rigid to the extent that all centers resonate in and all black holes fall on a single point of accumulation that is like a point of intersection somewhere behind the eyes. The face of the father, teacher, colonel, boss enter into redundancy, refer back to a center of significance that moves across the various circles and passes back over all the segments. The supple microheads with animal facializations are replaced by a microface whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. There are no longer N eyes in the sky or in becomings animal and vegetable, but a central computing eye scanning all the radii. The central state is constituted not by the abolition of circular segmentarity, but by a concentricity of distinct circles, or an organization of a resonance among centers. There are already just as many power centers in primitive societies, or, if one prefers, there are still just as many in state societies. The latter, however, behave as apparatuses of resonance. They organize resonance, whereas the former inhibit it. 3. Finally, in the case of linear segmentarity, we would say that each segment is underscored, rectified, and homogenized in its own right, but also in relation to the others. Not only does each have its own unit of measure, but there is an equivalence and translatability between units. The central eye has as its correlate a space through which it moves, but it itself remains invariant in relation to its movements. With the Greek city-states and Cleisthenes reform, a homogeneous and isotopic space appears that overcodes the lineal segments, at the same time as distinct focal points begin to resonate in a center acting as their common denominator. Paul Virilio shows that after the Greek city-state, the Roman Empire imposes a geometrical or linear reason of state, including a general outline of camps and fortifications, a universal art of marking boundaries by lines, a laying out of territories, a substitution of space for places and territorialities, and a transformation of the world into the city. In short, an increasingly rigid segmentarity. The segments, once underscored or overcoded, seem to lose their ability to bud. They seem to lose their dynamic relation to segmentations in progress, or in the act of coming together or coming apart. If there exists a primitive geometry, a proto-geometry, it is an operative geometry in which figures are never separable from the affectations befalling them, the lines of their becoming, the segments of their segmentation. There is roundness, but no circle, alignments, but no straight line, etc. On the contrary, state geometry, or rather the bond between the state and geometry, manifests itself in the primacy of the theorem element, which substitutes fixed or ideal essences for simple morphological formations, properties for affects, predetermined segments for segmentations in progress. Geometry and arithmetic take on the power of the scalpel. Private property implies a space that has been overcoded and gridded by survey. Not only does each line have its segments, but the segments of one line correspond to those of another. For example, the wage regime establishes a correspondence between monetary segments, production segments, and consumable goods segments. We may summarize the principal differences between rigid segmentarity and supple segmentarity. In the rigid mode, binary segmentarity stands on its own and is governed whereas in the other mode, binarities result from multiplicities of n dimensions. Second, circular segmentarity tends to become concentric. In other words, causes all its focal points to coincide in a single centre that is in constant movement, but remains invariant through its movements, and is part of a machine of resonance. Finally, linear segmentarity feeds into a machine of overcoding that constitutes more geometrico-homogeneous space and extracts segments that are determined as to their substance, form, and relations. It will be noted that this rigid segmentarity is always expressed by the tree. The tree is the knot of arborescence, or principle of dichotomy. It is the axis of rotation guaranteeing concentricity. It is the structure or network gridding the possible. This opposition between arborified and rhizomatic segmentarity is not just meant to indicate two states of a single process, but also to isolate two different processes. For primitive societies operate essentially by codes and territorialities. It is in fact the distinction between these two elements, the tribal system of territories and the clan system of lineages, that prevents resonance. Modern or state societies, on the other hand, have replaced the declining codes with a univocal overcoding, and the lost territories with a specific reterritorialization, which takes place in an overcoded geometrical space. Segmentarity is always the result of an abstract machine, but different abstract machines operate in the rigid and the supple.